everybody, welcome to the Underwater Photography Show. As always, I'm Matthew Sullivan.
And I'm Alex Mustard. And today, Matthew is the one who's been away shooting. So I get to ask him all about his most recent underwater shoot. It wasn't a diving shoot, but it was full of fish. So very much of interest in underwater photography. So Matthew, you're recently back from Alaska. Your last trip as a single man, because I know trip was just before your wedding. So it's kind of, so I'm really interested about the trip. I think that salmon photography is something that a lot of photographers are really interested in. But I'm curious as to why you went to Alaska, who you went with, how did you sort of choose this destination and set everything up?
Yeah, so I actually was leading this trip I have a friend who owns a travel company called Natural Selection Tours. He's really good about if I have a trip idea, and it's mostly like birds and big animals and things like that. And then I had pitched the idea to him if he wanted to start doing underwater adjacent type trips, that I'd be happy to run them for him. So he's pretty good about if I have an idea and it seems feasible, he just lets me kind of run with it and he'll help me set everything up, and we'll take it from there. So I had this idea a while ago to do I love salmon, as everybody watching this probably knows. And I've always wanted to, I'm not huge into big terrestrial mammals. For whatever reason, bears have always been the exception to that. And I've seen black bears here and there, but I'd never seen a grizzly and I'd never photographed a bear. So I pitched the idea of doing a salmon and bear trip to Alaska. I have a friend who is a full-time guide up there, and I tossed the idea out to him, and he's like, I've never done a trip like this, but let's do it and see how it goes. And fortunately, I had the group was fantastic. And as you know, the group can really make or break a trip. And the people who came with me this time were amazing. Everybody got along really well. Everybody had a fantastic sense of humor. And it was just, everything went fantastically. And then we also happened to have really good luck with salmon. So we spent 3 or 4 days on mainland Alaska down in the Kenai Peninsula, mostly focusing on just the salmon. And then we spent 3 days over on Kodiak Island, which is famous for brown bears. We had mediocre luck with the bears until the very last morning. And we had some really good luck with the salmon over there as well.
That sort of story, though, with the bears, would be ideal if you could win a contest with them. So you last morning, that's how the story's going to go. So
yeah.
So what species of salmon were you after on this trip? I know we've got some photos to look at in a minute. But
yeah. So in that area, they get all 5 of the Pacific Northwest species. So sockeye, coho, chinook, pink, and chum. On our trip, we saw 4 of them. The only one we missed was Chinook, I believe. And we got to photograph 3 of them. So we didn't get to photograph coho. They were just starting to run into the rivers when we were there. But they weren't there in big numbers yet. So the pinks were the ones that we were most successful with, especially in Kodiak. They were everywhere. We also had some decent luck with the chum and the sockeye, but we were on the tail end of their run. So most of the ones we saw of those species were starting to fall apart, which makes for really interesting portraits and things like that. But if you're after really fresh fish, it wasn't the time for either of those species. And then it was interesting. All the locals in Alaska were saying how poor a year it was for bears this year. And it turns out it's because there were so many salmon that the bears didn't have to congregate or aggregate in smaller areas. They could be wherever they want. And literally every creek and river we passed in Alaska was just choked with salmon. It was amazing.
Well, that's really heartening to hear as well.
Yeah, exactly. But it did make finding the bears difficult. But it was really nice to see that they're literally everywhere. And there were periods of certain rivers and creeks where you could walk through them, and there's just salmon just splitting every time you take a step because there were so many of them. So it was a really cool overall experience. But we do have some pictures I can show and kind of talk through.
Yeah, I'm also keen. I pulled the first picture up, which is sockeye. But I'm keen to hear about the gear you were using.
Yep.
You weren't diving. Were you snorkeling or were you shooting more crouched in
So
rivers
a sort of snorkel, sort of snorkel, sort of just crouching down. So actually,
with
the
your
very first
monitor out
day,
of the water, I guess?
yes. So the very first day, actually, my dry suit neck seal tore, and the one downside in Alaska is there's not a whole lot of dive shops to get
Mm.
repairs or spare parts. And while I did have a spare neck seal, for whatever reason, I had not brought the tool to install it. Fortunately, as we have mentioned 1,000 times on the show, I use a monitor for most of my shooting, and it ended up saving the trip for me photographically with regard to the fish, because the rivers are shallow enough that you could just kind of put the camera on the bottom, tilt the monitor up, and then the monitor's out of the water, and you can kind of see what you're shooting without having to actually be in the water. Some people opted to snorkel just to get fully immersed in it.
Yeah.
But by the end of the trip, I was actually wading into the rivers in my Crocs with my pants rolled up and just holding the camera down into the river. I brought the
How warm was the
WWL.
water?
It wasn't warm.
Yeah, I
It
was about to
was
say you're from Florida.
it was probably low 50s, I would say.
Okay.
So not frigid, but definitely not warm.
Yeah, I'd
Um,
expect it to be a bit colder than that, but maybe yeah. Freshwater's very
so
thick.
there were probably some of the smaller offshoot creeks were definitely colder. Like if you started in the
Oh,
main rivers and then moved to some of the smaller offshoots, the offshoots definitely felt colder. But in terms of gear, I brought the WWL and the 28 to 60 on the A1. That's the only lens I shot. Everybody else, I think, had fisheye, I believe, and then
but
one other person.
this is WWL.
Yeah.
Wow,
Uh,
I thought this was a wider perspective than that. Actually, I thought from the look of it, it was a rectilinear, a super wide rectilinear, which is why I was, it's got a really great perspective.
Yeah. So all WWL. I think one other person did have a WWL, and he alternated between that and fisheye, depending if he was shooting splits or not. But I had recommended to people ahead of time that they would probably want to bring mini domes or WWLs, things like that, just because these rivers are so shallow and they are very rocky. And if you're bringing a big dome, you could end up smashing it around,
Mm.
and it's harder to maneuver. I did suggest if people wanted to do split shots, they could bring a big dome, but I don't actually think anybody brought a big dome. And there were some split shots done, but they were all done with the small ports. And I actually did a couple with the WWL also, but I don't think I included them here. But this is like you said, this is a sockeye, and as I mentioned, they were starting to rot. We were late for them up in
Oh,
Alaska.
it looks amazing, though. I
It
mean,
does. They're very gnarly,
yeah,
especially because they develop that huge hook jaw when they're starting to breed. The males do.
yeah. This guy is amazing looking.
And in this particular area we were on the very tail end of their run. Other parts of Alaska, they were still going strong, but most of the ones we saw were starting to fall apart. The advantage of that is that they're much easier to approach when they're at this stage because they've just given up on life given up on life, so
Mm.
they don't care about you being present too much. Let's see if I can pull this closer. Sorry, um, but this was a fantastic fish, and I spent quite a while with him, um, just getting really close. And it was heartening to see that he was still swimming around, so at least he wasn't fully expired, and I
Yeah.
felt a bit better taking pictures of him. But in terms of strobes, I also brought the Retro Pro Maxes and I brought the Isotta Red 64s, both of which were fantastic for this. They're both wide beam, really soft light. I still shot them with diffusers all the time because those white areas on the salmon are really easy to blow out, and they are pretty reflective fish as well.
Did you have your strobes underwater or out of the water? I mean, this one looks
Uh,
underwater.
I had them underwater. Initially, the very first day, I was having some issues with my port fogging, and I couldn't really tell, so I kept moving my strobes all over the place, trying to figure out what was causing the funky lighting,
Yeah.
and my port kept fogging. So eventually, I sorted that out, but it did the strobes being underwater certainly helped
Yeah.
versus having them up above.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, I would say with port fogging, because it can be a real pain on, particularly when you're in, these sorts of environments. Is the key things is to have the inside of the housing as dry as possible. So silica gel is a big friend on
yeah,
these trips because I don't normally use it in my housing, but whenever I do cold water trips, I always have silica gel in my housing. just because the fogging can really hurt. And then try not to open your housing if you can avoid it, because that gets water in, but it also lets warm air in. And then give your camera time to cool down. So if you're arriving at a destination and you've got a bit of scoping time, leave the camera in the river so it's
Yeah.
cooling down. While you're working out the where you're going to shoot from. Obviously not in a strongly flowing bit, but yeah, those I just thought I'd mention that for anyone watching. Shall I move on to the next one then?
Yeah. Let's go to the next one.
So are
Uh,
these the pink salmon?
yes.
They're
So
great
we didn't
looking as
see
well.
anything. I'm sorry.
They're great looking as well.
Yeah, they're cool fish. Especially like the males, and some of the males can get a crazy humpback. And one of the local names for pink salmon is they call them humpies
Mm,
because the males get really really big humpbacks. And these are both males. The one in the back is starting to fade away, and looks
mm,
like he never got the chance to develop the hump. And the one closer, you can see it has a little bit of a hump, but it gets much more aggressive than that.
mm,
But this was on Kodiak, so we didn't really see pinks on the mainland. And then when we got to Kodiak, the dominant species were the pinks, and we had some okay luck in some of the bigger rivers. And then I suggested on the last day that we just try some of the little offshoot creeks because they were kind of funneled into them. And even if they parted when you would put your camera in the water and kneel down or lay down, they would immediately come back.
mm,
So if you just found a little spot with, a slightly deeper pocket that you could put the camera in, give it, 30 seconds or a minute, and they'd fill right back into those spots. And I also really liked the shallower areas because then you get some of the surface play as well.
mm,
And every single picture, especially shooting slow shutter, which I like to do, gave you a different effect on the surface and gave you different reflections off the fish as well, which I
mm.
really enjoyed. Um,
Yeah, I have to say, looking at your shots and thinking about it, I would say that the external monitor is almost a must-have for this trip, not just for just because if you can have your body out of the water, you're much more stable in these
yeah,
fast-flowing, shallow waters. If you have to lie down and look through the viewfinder, you're at the mercy of the current a bit. So actually being able to just sort of wedge yourself on your knees into the water or crouch down and look at the monitor, I think is actually the preferable way to shoot.
yeah. So I don't know if you can skip all the way to the last picture, but there is the final
Yeah,
picture in here. Yeah, so that's before that was on one of the earlier days when I just had the camera resting on the bottom and I just kind of squatted down
yeah,
and didn't have to actually be in the water. So that was, and the other nice thing is then I could wear a sweatshirt underneath my dry suit. So even though it was cold outside, I could still have a sweatshirt on, hood up, and be
mm.
nice and cozy while in the water. So the monitor for me was
So
invaluable on
breaking the
this
neck
trip.
seal was actually a good thing.
Yeah. So, but the monitor genuinely saved me from a
Yeah.
photographic perspective on this trip because I wouldn't have been able to shoot without it, or I would have been shooting blind the whole time, and who knows how that would have turned out. So,
Yeah, but I have to say, if I ever do one of these trips again, I think I will definitely try and take a monitor. As even though I don't own one, it just
yeah,
seems a really beneficial thing to have.
yeah, it's like I said, saved the trip, and it is much more comfortable physically to just sit there or kneel
Mm.
there than to try to be wedged down into the water in some of those
Yeah,
areas.
yeah, yeah, and you look really stable in the current, so it's really, really cool.
Yeah,
Right, I'll go back. So I want to see some of these pictures, and
yeah.
everyone's just had a quick preview. So who's this zombie?
So this is a female chum. So like I said, we were at the very end of the chum run, so there
Mm.
were some healthy ones around, and of course they were impossible. The chum weren't there in big enough numbers where they would get used to you really, or they would
Yeah,
be packed into a place, so they would just kind of have to be near you. A couple people did get some really really nice chum pictures that I still can't wait to see. They haven't posted them yet, but this female chum was in the same little spot for the 3 days we were in this river. And she was very much alive because you'd approach her and she would swim off and then eventually come right back. But she was one of the few, like that first sockeye, that didn't seem to care at this point of her life that you were shoving a port in her face.
mm.
Um, the only time she would get spooked is when you first got into the water and she would take off. But this, again, with the being so shallow with the surface reflections, I really enjoyed that. And I do have a split level of her where you can see the forest up above, but I really, as we've talked about a lot, I really like portraits of her, and I thought this was the most impactful portrait of her, and really shows just what a brutal life they live,
Mm,
especially at the end, because they're all they know is to just keep swimming upstream, no matter what, and it looks super unpleasant, but it makes for really cool pictures.
mm. No, it's an important model story. So now back to another big male sockeye. Is this the same one as the first picture? Same individual?
I
Or?
think so, but it was in a different part of the river, so I
Okay.
don't I'm not a
He's
hundred
got a
percent.
great hump as well.
Yeah, he was big and gnarly. But
Yeah.
he was over by the bank, kind of by himself, and I have a bunch of close up portraits of him. But in this particular spot, I liked the wider perspective. I liked getting his reflection on the surface,
Mm,
and a little bit of habitat around him. And it looks the aesthetic that comes to mind for me is it looks kind of painterly. And somebody
yeah.
else on Instagram mentioned the same thing that looks kind of like a painting.
Mm,
But a really cool fish, and I would like eventually to get some fresh sockeye. I know you have some really cool sockeye pictures from BC back in the day, and I've yet to have uh, a crack at the fresh ones.
mm.
But I'll always shoot a cool looking zombie because the nice thing about them is they all look different, so you can get some
Yeah.
really portraits
No,
of
but I
different.
think that yeah, I love the way the color is, basically rotting off the side of it. I mean,
Yeah.
it's part of the story, and
Oh yeah.
the fact that they die is also really important for the baby salmon because that's what puts the nutrients into the river that allows the baby salmon to feed.
Yeah.
So it's a very important part of the story. And if they all look perfect and healthy, you're not telling that story. So yeah, really really nice shot. Um, okay, a bit more in the rapids again. Are these back with the pinks? I'm not very good with
Yes.
salmon ID.
So
Yeah.
back to the pinks, and unlike the chum we mentioned before, the pinks were there in such big numbers that they kind of had to be close to you.
Mm,
And if you sat there for a little bit, they just kind of forget that you're there. And I don't know if that's a numbers thing or if that's just a pink salmon thing, because the previous times I photographed them, they're also pretty um, forgetful. And once you're in with them for a little bit, you're just a part of their environment, and they go about doing whatever they're doing.
mm.
Um, but again, the slow shutter speed really works for them because they're in such shallow water and that current rips. So every time you shoot a picture, it looks slightly different. And the
Do you
fish
remember how
move.
slow you were going? Down to about a
Um,
quarter.
I think when I looked the other day, these were at an eighth.
Okay.
Um, so the water's moving fast enough that even at an eighth, you get quite a bit of motion. It might have been a bit
Yeah.
slower than that on this one. But I also like it's kind of a surprise every time you take a picture and then look
Mm.
at it with the slowest shutter speed and all of the movement in the frame.
The
And
surface is so interesting.
yeah, and I think that was the biggest thing that I kept trying to tell people is like if you shoot in the shallower water, you're gonna get some sort of play off the surface, which can add a whole other dimension to the picture versus
Mm.
just being the fish.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes you want to, you're gonna fill the frame with the fish, which is cool, but if you can incorporate some of the habitat and it adds interest, that's a benefit to the
Mm.
overall picture.
Yeah.
I
And
think.
and with the WWL, because I mean, there's quite a bit of camera in and out the water on this sort of trip. Did you burp it specifically, or was the air coming out of it naturally when you went in?
It was coming out fine.
Mm.
I don't. I had it bayoneted on, which I think allows it to burp more easily by
Yeah.
itself than if you're threading it on. But I never had any issues with regards to it not flooding properly.
Mm.
And even when I would do some of the split levels, the line was nice and clean
Mm.
between the WWL and the port.
Okay, good.
Um,
Yeah, I was
because
just
that,
curious because people often ask about using them on, like big animal trips where you're snorkeling
yeah,
and things, and I'm always like, theoretically it's a good option, but if you get a bubble in, but it's just I'm always curious about how well. I mean, I have a WWL, but I tend to use it on scuba dives, and I don't even, you have more time or you have the ability to
yeah.
really look clearly through the lens. So yeah, I was just
I
curious about it.
It was something I had been concerned about ahead of time, but that I wondered if it was going to be a pain in the butt. But
Mm,
it never ended up being an issue. And I think also if debris and stuff gets in between the port and the WWL, it just gets washed right out in that current.
yeah.
And it never ended up being a problem.
I'm going to move on because I think there's some bear. Oh, we've got an out of water picture.
Yeah.
So is this a humpy?
Yeah. So this is another pink, and this is just to show there's so many of them that they end up getting funneled into any little bit of water to try to make their way upstream. And at least this season, you could have done an entire salmon photography trip without actually being in the water,
Yeah.
at least with the pinks, because there were so many of them. And this little creek,
This
it
is a
was
great
six
fish
inches
photo, though,
deep.
isn't it? Like,
Yeah,
it's a fish, but it's out of water. But you nailed that focus. I mean, I'm very
yeah.
impressed.
But yeah, they're just every little. I mean, this creek at most was 6 inches deep, and they're trying to fight their way up through like 2 or 3 inches worth of water in some of these outer areas. And this one I eventually felt bad for, and I gave him a little nudge upriver because he seemed to be caught in this one little outside eddy.
Mm.
Um, but it just again, it goes back to it's such a brutal existence they have that you end up kind of feeling bad for them. It's funny when you're photographing them, you feel bad for the fish, and then when you're photographing the bears, you're like, "Yeah, catch all the salmon." So it's funny how your perspective changes over the course of the trip. But it was interesting to me how many people on the trip were like, "Oh, I don't know if I'm gonna ever going to be able to eat salmon again after getting to spend time with them in the water because they really are amazing fish,
Yeah.
especially if you understand their natural history and their life cycle.
Mm.
They're remarkable creatures."
This is a lovely shot. Okay, this isn't a salmon. I'm not sure, quite what it is. I don't. My expertise. I think it's some hairy, sort of, brunette Ursus of some sort. So,
Yeah, so the very last morning, and I'll tell this story because it's relatively quick and it tied the trip together. The trip was put together for salmon and bears. Like we wanted to do the salmon, we wanted to do bears. We had no bear luck the first 4 days. Then one evening we had a quick flyby of a couple that were at a distance. We didn't really get to be close to them. So the last evening of the trip, I checked with everyone. I'm like, is everybody okay? Just going hardcore for bears tomorrow because we haven't gotten them. Like that's one of the big reasons we came here. Everybody was okay with it. So we got up really early the next day, but I still had everybody bring their underwater stuff because we had, there's still obviously
mm,
potential for doing some salmon opportunities. And actually all the pink salmon pictures were from this same day, just later on. But we drove down to this river that a couple bears had been reported at over the previous few days. And we found two of them in the water downriver, like playing with each other before sunrise.
oh
So we
wow.
all just kind of sat out in this little rock bar in the river, or gravel bar in the river, and just watched. And the sun came up, they got backlit. I think the next picture is one of the backlit pictures, but they for
This is
probably an
beautiful.
hour. Thank you. For probably an hour, they just played with each other. Maybe 100 yards downstream,
Mm.
and they weren't really fishing. They were just hanging out and engaging with each other. And then while we're standing there, my friend Josh, who was on the trip, he's like, "Hey guys, guys, guys," and nobody's paying attention to him because we're all photographing the bears. He's like, "Hey guys, there's another bear." And we look up, and another bear had walked out, maybe 15 feet from us, out of the woods, and
Whoa.
it just stood there. Not it was a surprise to see us as we were to see it. And he just stood there, looked at us for a little bit, and then turned and just walked downriver and joined the other two. And then the three of them just played for another, I don't know, half an hour.
But were
And then
they
for
like yearlings or were they?
so these three, the original two are apparently siblings who were
Okay.
orphaned.
Yeah.
So they just hang
Oh
out.
wow.
They just hang out with each other all the time.
Mm.
And then the third one, and I think somebody who was local there was photographing them the same morning and said that they're about 2.5. And
Okay.
then the third individual, which is the one um, that's walking towards the camera in that other picture, that
Mm.
one is about the same age, but it's unrelated. But it also was orphaned, and it just has kind of like glommed
Becoming.
onto the other two, and they hang out together.
Mm.
Um, so eventually, they all walk downstream. So we like ran up along the road that borders the creek and got back down ahead of them, and just waited. And they all ended up walking towards us and fishing in front of us for another 20 or 30 minutes. Just and you can tell they're young because they haven't totally figured out how to fish yet, and they kind of look goofy and floppy. Um, but it was interesting to see it because they're very picky about which fish they eat. And it makes sense because there's so many to choose from, but I hadn't really thought about it ahead of
Guess they
time.
want females, don't they? Females with eggs still.
I don't know because I saw one catch a male fish and it did eat it, but they would catch one and they would sniff it and then stick their tongue out and lick it and then either be satisfied and take it away into the woods and eat it before coming back for another one, or now that they've just gored this fish nearly to death, they would decide that it didn't quite smell or taste right and throw it back. Um, and that that poor fish is now his journey's over and he's released alive, but with 4-inch gouges through his body.
Mm,
But it
wow.
was interesting to see because it was very human-like that
Mm,
they decided, oh, I don't like this one, and they would just throw it back and then catch another. But I couldn't tell really if there was no outward rhyme or reason that it looked like to me that they would throw them back because they were. I saw one eat a male, what was clearly a male fish because it had the big hook jaw. I saw them throw ones back that looked fresh to me,
mm.
so I don't really know what they were
Well,
going
your
for.
nose is not as good as that of a grizzly, so
Yeah, exactly.
they know what's going on.
Yeah, but it was a really cool experience, and if it made me love bears even more. And I think one of my toxic traits is probably thinking that they have those nice fluffy ears that I could just go up and scratch their ears and they'd
Oh
be
yeah.
okay with it. But it was a fantastic trip. I do plan on bringing 2 groups next year. The details aren't arranged yet, but if anybody's interested, just reach out to me.
I'm sure there will
Uh,
be.
yeah,
Yeah,
so we'll
I
do
am.
another one. We'll do another one similar to how we ran this one this year, but with a few tweaks to make it a bit better. And then another one more in the interior to hopefully get some fresher sockeye and bigger bears. But details TBD.
Fantastic. Well, I'm so glad that I talked you into talking about this trip because it's a fascinating one and it shows what underwater photography gear can be used for. It's not just scuba diving. There's a whole world of opportunities out there. So thanks, Matt, and I hope you'll all join us again for another episode of the Underwater Photography Show again soon. Bye.